All right, welcome, April. If you can start by just describing who you are, what it is you do, and then also your definition of narcissism.
Hey, everybody. My name is April Harter. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have very much reconceptualized narcissism as an addiction to activating endogenous opioids through enmeshment.
Yeah. And I actually want to refer to that carousel that you sent me on Instagram because it was just so good about the traits of narcissism disorder. And I'm almost thinking we can take a moment to compare and contrast traditional narcissism, like narcissistic personality disorder, what's very well known and oversimplified in the media,
Mhm.
and then
Mhm.
your diagnostic criteria for narcissism disorder.
Mhm. I think that, and actually, I'm going to go to that post myself so that I can kind of sort of be there with you.
Perfect.
Um, so here's the deal, right? I think it kind of helps to talk about in a way why I even got to this. Like why did I verge from the traditional, definition of narcissism? Why did I do that? To be clear, like I didn't, I had no plans of becoming a therapist that was going to innovate in this regard and to come up with new definitions and new criteria and stuff like that. I just thought to myself, I'm going to be a feminist therapist. I'm going to help people who are oppressed. I'm going to help people because they usually don't get the help that they need. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to focus on consciousness raising, right? That was my focus. So I just thought I'm going to take the information that's already available, and help raise consciousness and kind of like get paid to fight the man. That was like my thing, like when I was an undergrad and a graduate student in college. And yeah, and then of course in trying to fight oppression, in many ways I had to understand the mind of the perpetrator
Mm.
because I wanted to understand how we can stop violence in the world. And you know what? I got a bit of almost like a foreshadowing actually in graduate school. I remember being at the Houston Area Women's Center. That was one of my places where I did, like my little graduate internship. And I was co-facilitating like sexual assault groups, survivor groups, domestic violence,
Wow.
child molestation groups. And I was like co-facilitating. So I was learning how to like facilitate these things, right? And I remember like waiting for the next group, right, the domestic violence group to come up. And my preceptor said, "Hey, just take the time. We've got some time. Check out some of these articles on my bookshelf and just read those and let me know like what you learn." And I was browsing through them and said, well, I already know this and I already know this and I already know this. And I was like, that's kind of boring. And then I came across this one article, and I don't even remember the title of it, but it was about the prevention of teaching feminism to prevent violence. And I was teaching feminism to perpetrators. And I thought, whoa, like that's, and there were all these studies that said if you teach feminism to the perpetrators, it helps prevent that violence and that it works really effectively. And I thought, well, that's great. So that kind of piqued my interest, the thought of working with perpetrators. And I remember after reading that article, she said, okay, she said, April, what did you learn? I said, well, you know what? I learned that like the way to prevent violence in the world is to work with the perpetrators. And she said, oh no, perpetrators don't change. They're just the way that they are. You need to stay away from them. They're toxic, like da, da.
Um,
So in many ways, that was kind of like my foreshadowing of dealing with narcissism. But little did I know I'd start looking at my own inner perpetrator later. Okay, so hold on one second.
Oh,
Hold on one second. You may have to edit this out because I'm
yeah,
about
take
to.
your time.
I forgot to get my adapter cord here. I'm sorry about that.
I kind of love that she said that to you. Like,
Yeah,
what did
that
you,
was. I remember being so pissed.
yeah,
Actually,
like, what was your response? Were you,
I was offended. I was pissed because she just kind of shut me down like really quickly. She wasn't really open to conversation and curiosity. It was just she just had this belief so strongly ingrained into her And really, looking, that's how I felt back then.
Yeah.
Now I look at it and go, she was projecting, she was reenacting, like she was just very upset and didn't want to like even entertain that thought. So I had more of an open mind and curiosity, and I was more focused on the results and not necessarily how it was done.
Mm.
So I was open to
Okay.
whatever to prevent violence and to stop oppression. I was open to whatever. And she had already said, well, I already made up my mind, perpetrators can't change. Don't work with, why would you work with them?
You just
They don't
have
do
to
it.
acknowledge the humanity in perpetrators, and I think that's something that people like makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah. And yeah, and so I thought, wow, that would be cool. But that she shut that down really quick. And then I just sort of didn't think of it for many, many years. And then I ended up, ultimately, so then I worked with codependents. I considered myself a codependence expert for a while, but really I wasn't. And now looking at my own, no, I wasn't good because I hadn't even dealt with my own narcissism yet. So that's a whole other can of worms, right? So that we're,
Oh,
so I thought I was good with codependency, but I really wasn't. I would have people, so I thought at the time that being really good at supporting the victims of violence, right? The victims of abuse was to sit there, have them vent, me validate, totally relate to them, and then they feel safe because I get them. And I thought that was healing. I thought that was like the way. But I never addressed the ways they harmed themselves. I didn't address self-sabotage. I didn't even address my own self-sabotage. So I really wasn't looking in the mirror. It was just like it was just, let's take the whole time to vent about perpetrators and how horrible they are.
mm.
Let's look for all the like, but let's not look in the mirror. Let's not look fully inward, and let's not hold ourselves accountable, because actually the only person that needs to be accountable is the perpetrator. So that was always the focus. The whole energy was like, they're bad, I'm good, I don't need to change, but they do. And that was the whole thing.
Like black
And
and white, very
very
binary.
very black and white, right? No, very little introspection. And there was, because also there was so much pressure to also stay within those confines of thinking.
Mm.
Remember from the beginning, like, because there was a part of me that wanted to fit in. I was like, I better not go against the status quo, because I'm not gonna, how am I gonna make a living? How am I gonna, it was like I wasn't really being authentic at the time.
Oh my gosh.
So I was scared because I was so passionate about, advocacy, right? That at the same time, I was being, as I call it now, very narcissistic, right? I was very enmeshed with um the culture of social justice and advocacy, to the point where it was like I was afraid of the loss of that relationship.
It's almost like a cult dynamic. Like you don't dare speak out. I mean, you did with your supervisor or whoever it was, and she said explicitly, "We don't do that."
And then I definitely fawned back there. Actually, okay. First response I had was definitely like passive aggressive, angry. I reenacted, uh, and she reenacted too. So it's total reenact. Like I look at it now and it's like so different
Mm.
compared to when I was younger and before I had therapy myself. And so is looking at that, it's like, ooh, we both reenacted. But anyway, so then fast forward, I started working later with, believe it or not, racists. And that was something that was very shocking to people too. He said, April, why do you want to work with white people? Why do you want to work with racists? And again, there was this thing in me that was like, well, if they learn, they'll stop being violent. If they learn. But then here's where I ended up switching into, this is when it started to kind of switch up a little bit,
Mm.
because I started working with these white people, and within the anti-racism scene, when I used to be a part of that like heavy anti-racism scene, what on Instagram especially, that's how I got my break originally. And what happened was that it was kind of like I started to notice, right, the abuse against white people
Mm.
within these circles. And the white people basically started fawning. They started fawning and going, well, if I'm a good white person, I'm just going to shut down and let people abuse me, right? So it was like, and as a Black woman at that time, before I started to realize that there was abuse going down, I also myself was very much, there was a part of me that was compassionate for white people. Another part of me said they deserve whatever's
Mhm.
coming, like basically in the
Totally.
sense I totally enabled and was complicit to justifying harm against them. And because in my mind, the way I was taught, and very much in a big way, was again back to very similar vein to what I said before.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm the good person, they're the bad person. Again, as you said, lack of humanity. So it was like, if they're a perpetrator, we don't need to be humanistic to them. We don't need to care for them at whatsoever because that's not our job, right? So there was a part of me that thought that, but then that was different than actually my ethics and values as a social worker
And you
because these people, uh-huh.
Sorry to interrupt. You said something on Luis's podcast that is coming forward for me right now as you say this. It was something like a justification to treat someone with a lack of humanity because like their actions warrant basically the same thing back. That's the justification for this
Yeah, that's right.
cycle.
Right. So I it would it's a delusional thought. It's a delusional thought. That thought, that's what I teach people in the work that I do now. The justification of harming people because they perpetrated is actually delusional thinking. There's a difference between self-defense versus I'm just going to go and now harm people preemptively. There's a difference, right?
Mhm.
But at that time I couldn't tell the difference because I hadn't done enough of my own work. I didn't look enough in the mirror because I didn't feel that I needed to because I've been oppressed, this and that. I didn't have to fully look at my own inner perpetrator. But in working with white people, I did have to look at my own inner perpetrator. I did have to start going, I'm really angry with these people.
Mm.
Pissed. Like the racism I've been through, like I hadn't healed from the racial trauma. Not enough to where I could see clearly and discern like what's happening. So
And
it's okay.
what did your work look like with them?
Ooh, basically, yeah, just a lot of consciousness raising. I definitely with them, they were so funny.
Were
Funny,
these
but not,
like groups?
they
Like
were funny, right? So I
groups?
ran, so I ran coaching groups, right? I called it anti-racism coaching, right? And they basically were upset with me because I wasn't abusing them.
Okay, that's
Actually,
tell me
fully
more.
expected to be abused.
Did
They were,
they
I was,
they want
yeah,
to be like did they feel like given the climate that was created surrounding that topic, did they feel like it would pay their penance?
yeah, yeah.
Mm,
They felt like
that's crazy.
right. So I'm trying to teach them, right? I'm trying to teach them. And predominantly white women, although there were folks
Okay.
that also a few that identified as non-binary, etc., right? And so I had mostly predominantly white women, right? And this is what back in 2019, 2020, like 20, well, a little bit 2018, 2019, 2020, around there, right?
Okay.
And basically they thought that I must be teaching something wrong because I'm not abusing them, but they don't realize they want to be abused. And yes, they think that they thought that me abusing them was boundaries. So when I was not abusive to them, they thought that as a Black woman that I couldn't be trusted because I must not understand how dangerous they are. So they were like, but other Black people, other people are so angry at us and they're so, I'm like, so I'm here to teach you how to love yourself. They're like, but I don't deserve to love myself because I'm such a racist. That's wrong. Isn't that centering myself? I'm like, but actually you do need to actually work on yourself so that you stop the cycle of violence towards others because you're violent to yourself and then you turn around and get violent to other people. So this was very much a prototype to the work that I do now. I just didn't realize it. I thought I was going to stay in
Wow.
anti-racism work for a long. I didn't even realize. Oh no, this is like pre-narc work. So I started to notice that that racism is so much more than just the Klan. I started seeing like, I started to realize this is a mental health issue. I had people that would DM me years ago that would say, I just got out of inpatient psych because I tried to kill myself because I was jumped on by so many people because I accidentally said something racist online and I didn't understand it in the comments section and I wanted to die because everyone jumped me. It's all this shame. So these people were coming to me with a ton of shame for the racist behaviors that they had done. And then they wanted me to punish them. And I was like, that's not what I do. You see?
Yeah.
See what I mean? So back to the beginning, right? I said, so there is this thing of if you perpetrator, you need to be punished, and that's the way that you make it up.
That's how we rectify the world.
Correct. Instead of rehabilitating the quote criminal, rehabilitating them, you just want to go and hang them. Like that, that's actually the dichotomy we're talking about here. So I'm more from the rehabilitative side, right? Versus um I'm going to just punish you and that's the way you're going to change. And it's like what I noticed was that when these people made mistakes and they did very bad things and then they wanted to be shamed too and I wouldn't shame them.
Mm.
And at the time
It's almost
I
like
was
kinky. Like it's almost like kinky, like BDSM, where they're like
it is.
coming to you like strap me up and whip me because that's what I
Mhm.
deserve.
And that in and of itself was enmeshed, right? So right, you're right. So that was
This
them
is just like
actually
make
getting
it's just clicking. Everything's
yeah,
clicking.
it's clicking. So this is all prototype of the work I do now. So I didn't understand. They were actually addicted to POC, for a lack of better words, beating their ass about their racist behavior. So they were actually unconsciously getting off to getting abused. And basically they were reenacting probably childhood stuff where they were, I have to now prove to my parents that I'm worthy by accepting, by fawning, by accepting. So we had a lot of
Oh.
fawners, a lot of fawners.
Mm.
Um, and when I wouldn't enable that fawning, they said, but that's what we paid for. We want you to get us in check and get us in line. And I just had a very loving, gentle, compassionate approach. And they were confused by that. And yeah, it was, I mean, you would think people would appreciate that, but no, they were like, yeah. So that was the work that I used to do. And then I started to see basically the corruption within social justice. And I started to see aggressive, passive aggressive behaviors and go and really even again look at my own passive aggressive behavior. And so I started to realize that that's something I don't want to do. And that's something I can't enable. But I had to hit rock bottom. And so as an influencer, I actually,
Positive.
yes, back in what, 20, yeah, in like 2020 or so, or 2019, no, 2019, I ended up, there was an African American woman who plagiarized my work. And I absolutely, completely reenacted. And I started trying to take revenge and like shame her publicly. And it went like back and forth. It was horrible. It was very narcissistic, very horrible. And so when that happened, I lost a ton of followers. And then I had a complete breakdown, crying on Instagram. Just breakdown, totally breakdown, broken down. And then I realized, oh my God, I need to get help. It's like any addict. It's like, oh my God, I've hit rock bottom. I need to go get help. And that's when I went to therapy. Well, that's when I went to therapy. And after I went to therapy, I noticed in therapy that there were aspects of the therapy it wasn't really helping me. So I got EMDR, but it was parts of it. And I'm like, why do I keep doing this? Why? Like, why do I have this compulsion to keep doing certain things? So in trying to understand myself, I go, well, I identify as a codependent. And I go, I keep on getting ensnared with narcissists. I keep on falling for stuff. Why does this keep, I can't stop. I'm going to therapy. It still won't stop. So I started to go, I sat down, I started looking at the definition of codependency again. And then I really started going back into narcissism, the definition. I started looking at them both. And at the time too, I would say that racists were narcissists, right? But then I started noticing even the rate. I'm like, it isn't as simple as you're self-centered, you're this, you're that. It's so much more nuanced than that.
Mm.
So violence can be so much more nuanced because violence can be towards ourselves or to others. So I started looking at both the definitions and I sat down, I look, go, they have the same childhood background. They are actually acting very similarly. I don't know what the difference is between them, actually. They're really, I'm being very open about it. I'm like, wait a minute, why is there this belief that there's something different between the codependent and the narcissist? And then I had to do some CEUs, and I had never done CEUs as a social worker on addiction
Mm.
because I was like, I don't want to work with addicts.
Oh no.
I didn't even, in denial of my own addiction, of course. And like, I told myself, I don't want to work with addicts because they'll never change.
Oh my gosh, the
I had,
cycle.
uh-huh. So I had all these preconceived, again, notions, whatnot, right? Narcissistic. And
Wow.
then so anyway, I learned about addiction and then I was like, oh my God, racism is addiction. All this stuff is addiction. Codependency is addiction. And of course, with codependency, they do tell you you're an addict, but they say you're an addict to the narcissist. No, no, no. It's more than that. It's more than that.
And that creates that victim perpetrator binary context again.
So then after that, I started to go, there's something happening underneath the surface. What is the root of this? That's why I was like, I could sit here all day and describe things about symptoms, right? But what is really happening underneath the surface? And that's why I ended up I had to teach myself a lot of anatomy and physiology and neurobiology. I had to teach myself this online. And after scouring the internet, like with clinical research papers, I was like looking for addiction and these symptoms. And I came across the brain opioid theory of social attachment. And that theory is what helped me really understand that we're dealing with an addiction. And that's why I feel very confident when I say an addiction to activating endogenous opioids. But my twist to that added is that it's enmeshment. Because what I'm seeing there is pure enmeshment. Even the way I define enmeshment is very different because the way that enmeshment originally is with family systems. It's with family systems therapy, family therapy, right?
Mm.
And so it's when people think of enmeshment, they just think, oh, well, you don't know, you're blended. There's like no separation between you and me. And that's what people know about enmeshment, but it's more than that. So, bottom line, I started really looking at the root of all of this. And I had no idea that when trauma happens, I mean, even though, Besser van der Kolk, he actually wrote a clinical piece years ago stating that Vietnam veterans, when they saw, let's say, a movie or something like that, and it triggered them, it was like, I can't remember how many milligrams, but so many, they measured it, so many equivalent of so many milligrams of morphine were getting shot in the body, basically, from within.
When they were feeling triggered and activated.
Correct, correct. And so
Mm.
you see, so the reason my whole thing, because I had to explain it, my whole thing is I started to trust in neuroscience and biology over what's popular or what everyone thinks something is. And I started to go, okay, but what is really happening? And that's
Mm.
why I feel really comfortable and confident with the work that I do now. Because I'm like, I know the science, I know what's going on in the body, and I'm like, this is what's happening. So, um, anytime you read
Very
stuff,
brave.
anytime you read stuff about narcissism or codependency, if you ask people, okay, but what is the mechanism that's causing this? Well, trauma. Okay, but what causes the compulsion? Why can't the compulsion stop? Because it's an addiction. So narcissism and codependency are both addictions, and I see it all as narcissism because, like I said on another post, I kept the word narcissism. So a
Yeah,
lot of people,
that's one of my questions for you
but
is
define the word, right? Go on. Mhm.
Yeah, my question, because I was having questions just pop in my head all week long, so I was thinking about this chat with you. And one of my questions was, I'm just going to read it as I wrote it. If it's a relatively new concept, like this definition of narcissism, why not make up or use a new word? Why use a word with so much stigma and negative connotation?
Yes. And trust and believe me when I say I wish I could come up with a new word. I it would be so much, my life would be so much easier.
Yeah,
But the word is so perfect. The word is so perfect. The root word of narcissism is actually narc, which is to numb. And it is literally what is happening in the body
because of the opioids.
because of the opioids. That's where we get the word narcotic. So, like, it's interesting because actually the word narcissism was actually used basically inappropriately from the start because we didn't understand neuroscience at the time. So when Freud and
What about Narcissus, though? Isn't there that whole story about
yes, because
Narcissus?
right, right. So the thing is that with the history of the word narcissism, yeah, they use Narcissus and the whole story with that with Echo. Echo is basically the equivalent of the codependent. Like this is this whole myth, right? But this is oh my God, this gets into a whole can of worms because um when Freud and others, especially Freud was actually a cocaine addict.
Okay, tracks.
That's a whole other can of worms. That's what I'm like
Um,
when him and so many other people came up with this, the only thing they saw was self-centeredness. But they couldn't, but Freud himself was no specialist in addiction. He even said himself, he said, if we could ever prove that narcissism has some, I cannot make this up. He wrote an article called On Narcissism. And he said, he said in it, I just read it like last year at like thoroughly. And he said, if we could ever prove that narcissism is caused by, what did he say? Um, I don't remember the words he used, but basically he said by essentially biologically, if we could prove it. He basically said, if we could biologically prove why narcissism exists, then everything I'm saying is completely wrong.
well, oops.
so
Oops.
basically, the reason why people continue to believe narcissism is just the way it is because nobody wants to look at the biology of it. As
Well,
far as it goes is you were abused as a child, and that's it.
I think that it's definitely that. And then I think in the last X amount of years, it's evolved a new meaning. I was actually just listening to Luis's podcast episode on like pop psychology words, and one of them was like narcissist, and someone on the podcast said my nephew's using this word about his teacher, like, calling her a narcissist. So I feel like it's just even further evolved into this really casually used term.
Yeah. It's like saying you're a bad person, you're a sinner, you're a bad
Yeah,
person, this and that's why it's so stigmatizing, right? So
totally.
that's the story. I mean, in as short as I can say it because it's extensive, but basically I eventually started to realize that um we are I started to realize that the way that we activate that numbing, so it's a compulsive numbing, narcissism, it's ism. It's a compulsive numbing, activation of numbing. How do we do this? Through either violating other people's boundaries or failing to enforce our own boundaries, right? So the classic codependent looks like someone who fails to enforce their own boundaries, and the classic traditional narcissist is someone who violates other people's boundaries. However,
Mm.
the codependent, the way that they violate people's boundaries is so much more subtle and covert. And that's why it doesn't appear so quote narcissistic, right?
Yeah,
So basically codependents are in denial of their own perpetration. And so that's another reason why I kept the word, because actually they're codependents are being very narcissistic.
they're one
Uh,
and the same.
they're one and the same. So I'm seeing the biology matches the word etymologically and literally from what I've researched, right? It's the perfect thing. And I'm not seeing any difference between the behaviors Because if you're looking at just as an addiction to activating endogenous opioids, there's different strategies for doing that. Different strategies. So
And some are
once
more socially acceptable than
yes,
others.
correct. So codependency is so much more socially acceptable. In other words, manipulation, which absolutely is abusive as hell. Um,
Mhm.
Absolutely in my practice, like I'm treating my patients and, they are absolutely, um, their parents, for example, their mothers, totally manipulative. On the outside, they look so perfect. They would never fit the like profile of a traditional narcissist in that sense,
Mhm.
right? But yet the damage is being done to my patient, right? Like it's the same. So we even downplay manipulation, like playing with people's emotions, like we downplay that. Um, and it, so yeah. So I have patients that totally fit the profile of traditional narcissists and fit the profile of a codependent. And that's, I guess you could say, part number three. If if it isn't what it is, then why am I able to treat both? And I treat them the same way as an addiction.
Okay.
So that's the other thing I feel confident about is like, well, if I'm treating the traditional narcissist as well in my practice and they're getting better, and I'm treating it because I'm framing it as an addiction and they're getting better, that's good. That proves that it is an addiction. And then they're stopping the compulsion to harm others.
Because they're not as in the cycle of feeling like they need to violate others' boundaries.
Because they are detoxing. So
Mm.
they're and detoxing. Um, so they are, so detoxing in my work is, you know, detoxing from maladaptive schemas, which is essentially the rationale and justification for the urge to either violate someone's boundaries or to fail to enforce our own boundaries. Okay. That's the foundation. And I do that through EMDR.
Okay.
And I do that through EMDR. And a lot of people are like, well, April, can I just go to EMDR? I'm good. No, because it's a little bit more complicated than that. My colleagues, like what we're taught in EMDR is we have to do something called case formulation. It basically means we're like strategizing how we're going to apply that EMDR. But the way that I do it is within that theoretical framework that I've created. So I do case formulation in such a way where I use EMDR to treat someone with my theoretical framework. So that's why it's effective. If all you do is use the EMDR to address any trauma, it's not going to stop the compulsion. That and it comes back to my own treatment that I had with that therapist. Like she could not stop my my narcissism. I was like, I kind of feel less triggered, but I can't stop this compulsion. And I didn't know how to name it at the time. So that's the thing. If you go get EMDR, so for those listening, you're like, oh, just get EMDR, I'm good to go. It's like, yeah, I've had so many people online say, oh, just get EMDR, I'm good. And then that's it. And I'm like, yeah, but it's a little bit more complicated than that because you
So,
actually have to target the you have to target the memory connected to the source of enmeshment.
okay. Well, that answers my question. I was going to ask, well, what about just focusing on healing anxious attachment?
So anxious attachment is so then we get into secure and insecure attachment. I also see that a little differently. I see all insecure attachment as narcissism and secure attachment as not being narcissistic. So, and that's definitely not the mainstream. And people even say online, oh, I've got an anxious attachment style. I'm like, oh no, you're just being narcissistic.
So, I really want to tie this back into fawning
Yeah.
because I'll just preface it with
Oh yeah, because that's fawning anxious
this.
attachment. Right?
Girl, I've been freaking out reading your post. I'm like, this is me. And
Yes.
I created a post a few weeks ago, and the title was, I'm a master manipulator. I know exactly what to say to get you to like me. And then I wrote this whole post about fawning because that's what it is saying, I know exactly what to say, what to wear, what when to laugh, how to not laugh too much to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
you not hate me.
Right. That's why I love that clip you did with the fairy. It's like master finding the little fairy wings. I love that on Instagram. Your post on that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm
And
like, it's so perfect. Yeah.
this is everyone who follows me
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
relate to this work. And I will say too, the language, I hear you that you use the word narcissist. It's a little scary
Yeah.
because one of your posts it says, as a child of narcissistic parents, you became a narcissist. The denial of this truth is real and hard to accept. And then I wrote something during this week that basically says like when we are healing from healing in quotes because it's the kind of healing structure that you described at the beginning where we are saying okay, our parents were the perpetrators, we were the victims of this. What I've noticed in myself and in a lot of groups that I'm in is that we want to distance ourselves. Like, that is not me. I don't want to
Yeah.
be like that. I'm not that. And in relationships, every ex is a narcissist, but I'm not.
That's right.
And it just creates this huge separation of like and dissociation from our
Yes.
own parts that are narcissistic. And I'm just curious if you can talk on that, on like, I mean, you kind of already did at the beginning too, with like this black and white binary thinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. I feel like I love this question. I feel like you're really penetrating deeply in asking this question. So that's very entertaining for me. Just as an aside, I'm like, I love these kind of questions.
Okay, good. Yay.
It's because it's going to get really juicy. It's going to get
Yeah.
into aspects of, um, I think you want to get a sense of what examples of my patients where they reenact and why they do that. Because that's what I think a lot of people listening are gonna be like, oh yeah, I can identify with that. Um,
Mhm.
because with anxious attachment, let's start with this. With anxious attachment, it is a response to having a parent that is abusive as hell. Because you learn early on that if I were to fight, I'm going to get punished more. That's what fawning's all about.
Mhm.
Fawning is, I've learned and I've been conditioned that if I fight back or if I disagree in any kind of way and I don't fall in line, I'm going to get it worse. That's what that is. So, but it also teaches us when we're fawning, it teaches us to be manipulative because then that's like saying, oh, well, now I can predict and know what I know what they want. Now they want me to submit. So if I submit, then I can get what I want, right? So we learn that early on because the parent is being manipulative to the child by
Mhm.
intimidating them. So fawners have been intimidated from the time they were very little, intimidated.
And then we're going back now to the groups that you taught on anti-racism. And though that group of people who had that dynamic with their parents coming there and saying, please, April, punish me. This is how
Yes.
we make it right.
Got it. You got it. I'm beautiful, beautiful connection. Um, correct. So they came in reenacting as if and wanted me to be their abusive parent because they learned in their mind that the only way to be good is to take abuse.
Okay.
The only way to be good is to be compliant. The only way to be a good person. Otherwise, you're bad. You're a bad person. So that's the reason why many of your
Wow.
listeners go, I don't want to identify with that because I'm bad. I don't want to look bad. And guess what that's connected to? Perfectionism. That is perfectionism. And that is also about letting go of control. Because,
Wait, can you say that again?
yes,
Like, yeah.
perfectionism. Because perfectionism is supposed to be pure, clean, no mistakes.
Hmm.
So fawners don't want to make mistakes. Fawners want to appear like they're not making any mistakes. So they become little perfectionists. And that's because they harbor a lot of shame. Okay. And that shame is internalized from their parents telling them, if you don't submit, you should be ashamed of yourself. And then I'm going to intimidate you. to like do what you're told. So you learn early, this is the way to be safe. The way to be safe is to be good. The fairy, I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to submit. I'm going to do what I'm told. Otherwise, I'm bad. Right? So everything about let's not look bad. Let's do everything not to look bad. So
Mhm.
then when you start looking at your own narcissism, that's terrifying because then
Scary.
it's terrifying because then it's like, wait a minute, I'm looking at what's bad, but I'm not supposed to be bad. I'm supposed to be compliant, submissive, like do what I'm told. But then when you start looking at correct, with the ways that you yourself, right, that we can be manipulative, then we start to see the darker side of ourselves, right? And we do this to survive from childhood. So all that's
Mhm.
about is I'm going to fawn to survive in this very toxic, narcissistic situation because parents who intimidate like that violate boundaries. So then I'm now going to manipulate you and just because it has to do with lessening the degree of psychological damage that's been done. Because then if you can submit, you might be able to
Yeah.
survive the fight. Okay. And then you get conditioned into that. And those are the schemas. Those are maladaptive schemas. Those are the negative self-talk. These are the conditioning that we learn. We have to reverse the conditioning. So I use EMDR to reverse the conditioning. Once you can reverse the conditioning, you stop the cycle of enmeshment because what drives it all are all of these things that we learned as a kid. If I do this, this happens. If I do this, this happens. When we actually reverse that, basically deprogram from, you could say, I think we had talked about cults and stuff before, because if you can reverse the programming, then you let go of manipulation. You let go of that. You let go of control. You let go and go because it's delusional to even think you can control others. That's a delusion.
Mhm.
So whenever so what I'm trying to say here, back to what you're saying about why is it so hard to look at that narcissism? Because the definition doesn't match. If you start looking at this definition, you could be more open to it, but
Mhm.
also um, because when we look at that word narcissism, it's so stigmatizing, so shameful.
Totally.
But that's because we're rejecting that wounded part of us that needs to heal, which is that darker side. That is that shadow work, right? So this is also another way to look at it as a shadow work, right? We're really looking at our shadow. So it's like saying that shadow part of us is not like we need to reject that. We need to let that go. But in reality, that's a part of us. That's a very important part of us, right? And that shouldn't be rejected. And the shadow just means the unconscious. It just means the part of us that we don't understand. So that's so important in understanding who we are and our identity. Because if we don't understand, because trauma will, and that's a whole can of worms, and that's like in a podcast episode I did the other day, which is boundaries are really about expressing our identity, expressing our definition, not about because you're either going to do boundaries based on safety. I'm going to set a boundary to be safe. I'm like, no. Boundary is I am maintaining my integrity. I'm maintaining who I truly am. This doesn't align with me. This does. That's what a boundary is. Not based on a certain safety situation. Now I'm going to learn how to protect myself and set boundaries. That's not what a boundary is. A boundary is very unique to us. And basically, and this is taboo as well, but I'll say it. Nobody, in my opinion, nobody can teach anybody to set boundaries.
Yeah, I
Um,
saw that on one of your posts. I'm very curious about
Boundaries
that.
are unique to us. So only we can define ourselves. Yes, we can have people to help us heal, for sure, help support us to do that healing, but boundaries are actually organic. They are organic and they come from a healed heart, not you don't reverse your people, folks do not want to detox because the truth is that we as people do not want to let go of our attachment needs. Anxious attachment is I'm going to fawn right? Unconsciously, autonomic nervous system. I'm going to fawn because that's what I learned to do to be safe. But it also means this is how I get my needs met from my parents. I have to submit to eat. I have to submit to do these things just to survive. And we've got to like reverse that. Like the manipulation part is with fawning is the whole concept of what happens if you stop fawning. That means you're going to have to survive without trying to manipulate everybody around you. It means you actually have to be authentic, and you very well may lose some of the things that you need to survive with in certain ways, but you also you could get that without fawning. So
Mm.
that's the thing. You have to let go. I'm sure you can understand this. When
Mm-hmm.
you reverse fawning, there are things you're just not gonna get to partake in right anymore, right?
Yeah,
Because you're gonna
totally.
benefit. That's detox. Detox is you're not gonna have those things that you want if you stop fawning. It's very hard for people to stop fawning because then if they stop fawning, they're gonna stop getting some of their attachment needs. And they don't consent to that. And you have to consent to that. It can't be forced.
To stop fawning.
To stop to let go of attachment needs. So you have to consent to go, I'm not going to get this attachment need met. And attachment needs are the needs that we get from our relationships. So it means if I stop fawning, I may not get affection. If I stop fawning, I may not get money from my boyfriend. See, then you're not going to get what you want. You're going to have to accept that you're not going to get that if you were to remain in your own integrity and be honest to yourself about like, actually, I don't like this and I really don't, then you got to maintain, you got to let go of being manipulative.
Yeah. I mentioned to you before we started recording that I started working with Kali and that she destroyed my life. And what happened was that I started experiencing loss, and it made me like grief is very energy consuming, and I didn't have the energy to fawn. And it
Mm,
wasn't like a choice. It was
yeah.
like stripped from me, really.
Yeah.
And everything you're describing, it you just relationships fall away. It's just how it goes when you've structured your entire life around, in your words, like getting these needs met super unconsciously. But then you start to just not have the energy or not manipulate as much. It just things shift, structures change, and it's fucking painful. And I think that's why your work is very I think there's a few reasons why your work is very intimidating. One is just because it invites you to acknowledge your parts that are quote unlovable, and then it also invites you to release structures that you've taken years to build.
Mhm.
And it's heartbreaking to do that. And that's what I think you call detox.
Yeah. Yeah, I call detox, because it's detox because you're reversing. There's three, I call it three components to detox. The foundation is letting go of those um of the rationale and justification for why you do what you do, right? For example, fawning. So I'll focus on the fawning, right?
Mm.
Like
Yeah.
rationale why you fawn. What makes it acceptable to fawn? Well, I did that because I need to get this. Yeah, but you got to let that go, right?
Mm.
When you start to let that go, you stop then, for example, with fawning, you're going to self-sabotage and you're going to fail to enforce boundaries. But when you start changing the rationale and justification, you also start to really you'd also develop intimacy within yourself. You get to understand yourself more, what you consent to, what you do not consent to, what you agree with, what you don't agree with. And that is actually what eventually makes it safer to let go of getting your attachment needs, is because you feel safe in your own integrity and it's okay to let those things go. because those things don't define you. You define yourself. Because before, so much of yourself is going to be wrapped up and defined in those things outside of yourself. And you can't imagine a life without those things. But then really with that loss, right?
Yeah.
You're now when everything else falls apart around you, you're faced to go within. Like the new moon, you have to go within, right? And so yes, this work you have to go deep within. A lot of my patients, like what they've told me is that they've done like all kinds of things like ayahuasca, and that the work we do together is even more potent than ayahuasca. It's like it's
Mhm.
to give, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners may have done ayahuasca perhaps, or if they're similar in my vein, because a lot of people who like my work, they like the idea of ego death, right? So this work is also basically ego death. So there's a lot of way to call it, right? Clinically I call it detox. It's also ego death, shadow work. Like there's a lot of ways to kind of to look at it. I just have a particular framework for getting into it very clinically, just a different kind of a framework. But but yeah, you have the loss of those schemas, the rational justification for why you're doing what you're doing, which then builds up who you truly are, and then it makes it safe to let those things go. But you're going to have a lot of withdrawal symptoms. You would have experienced a ton of withdrawal symptoms, and that's what
Oh
anxiety
yeah,
and
I know.
and
It's painful.
that
It's like literally like feels like what I imagine withdrawal. I mean, I've withdrawn from sugar before, and it's like the deep cravings.
Mhm. So yeah, and the craving, by the way, is the craving for the attachment need. And that's normal to want attachment needs. It's just that there's a moral way to go about doing it, an immoral way to go about doing it. That's also taboo within my field. Well, you can't tell people what's moral and immoral. I'm like, oh yes, I will. Absolutely, I will. And I'll say if it's harming you or somebody else, it's immoral. And
But
if it's and if
no
it's
one,
not, mhm.
nobody cares about harming yourself though.
Correct.
That's okay. It's okay to harm
Okay.
yourself
Yes.
in fawning. You just can't be a traditional narcissist and harm other people
And
because
harm other people. Well, I tell you why that is, because it looks bad. It's about reputation too, because it looks bad.
and
See,
we don't do
don't
that.
look right. So if you do it secretly to yourself and harm yourself, it doesn't look bad unless it gets out.
And
That's
then
basically
you're a martyr, so it actually adds to your image even more.
yeah. It makes you even more heroic. Yeah.
Yes. I have a point that I wrote down that I'd love to get to, and this is like what I've seen, and as I've done my own detox led by Kali Ma, um, is that this is extremely pervasive. And by that, I mean there's no part of your life that is safe from this addiction to enmeshed relationships. And I've seen this in the practitioner space. I had some mentors who I thought, with my background, I'm like, oh my God, they're so amazing. Everyone loves them. They're chameleoning with every person. They were making lots of money. And in hindsight, I was like, something about it felt a little icky and a little culty. And it wasn't until
Manipulative. Something in you knew there was manipulation occurring.
manipulation. It wasn't until honestly very recently, probably in the last 6 months or so, that I've looked back on it and said, there was so much the practitioners holding space were fawning, and it actually created a really gross feeling structure of enmeshment of
Mm,
the people working with them thinking, oh my God, we're so close,
mm,
but they weren't so close. And it
mm,
creates confusion and it creates a culty feeling, and it's just very icky. And I feel like this addiction, like you say, it it it's all pervasive. Like you can't not do this in your work and do it in your personal relationships.
Yeah, because it's all personal. Because it comes back to childhood traumas. Because you're going to be reenacting these traumas, like, and when you reenact, you're dissociating. Oh, and that's the other thing I want to tell you, but
Oh yeah, please.
very important about dissociation. Dissociation is not talked about enough publicly. Um, Dissociation also, there are the theory about dissociation is that there are a lot of theories about what causes dissociation. I what I believe is that yes, dissociation is also caused by that endogenous opioid release. We basically get high. So when we fawn, we're high, and
Oh,
that's
it's
what
such a high.
it's a high, and so we're you know whether it's super big time violence, we're dissociating and getting one would think, well, how do we get high off of violence, right? Because adrenaline actually activates endogenous opioids. And then it's funny too because like people think, oh, oxytocin is a love hormone. I'm like, oxytocin is the endogenous opioid chaser. Oxytocin, what it does is that it's like what it does is enhances the euphoria of the endogenous opioid release. That's why it feels extra because it's actually it's the chaser. It enhances. People always think that oxytocin is the love. I'm like, no, it's endogenous opioids. That's what gets activated in social bonding. So that's another thing everyone needs to remember is that, like, or know about my work is that the reason also it's very confusing is because we we lack discernment because endogenous opioids get activated through pain, but also through pleasure. So when you talk about kink and all that, that's actually kind of true because uh kink is kink and it feels great because the pain releases and activates endogenous opioids, which causes euphoria. That's why with cults you have euphoria. Oh my God, the cult leader, like, oh, we just love this person, and and all this, right? Because the followers are experiencing euphoria, okay? Because they're getting high. Because you get high through social bonding and through psychological pain. So what happens when you're a kid is that you're the target of enmeshment, which is a boundary violation from parents, and you're getting unconsciously high off of it and you dissociate. So when we dissociate, our it's really messed up. Our memory, our memory cells are literally getting flooded with numbing agent. And what it's doing is it's causing a distortion of reality. That's why we have depersonalization, derealization, and dissociative amnesia. We have like this distorted sense. So in our narcissism, our maladaptive schemas are, guess what, are delusional thinking. And how do we get it? Because we were high. In other words, the trauma we went through, our brain went, this is how we make sense of it, except it doesn't make any sense at all. And then we use that to justify to get another hit and another hit and another hit. We literally learn. So our brain goes, for example, fawning is cool because I'm safe. I have to do this. But we're in an altered state of reality when we are being perpetrated upon as kids. We're actually in an altered state of reality.
Okay.
We have to reverse that. So that's the thing too about dissociation is that when you, of course, you have, CPTSD, the core of it all is healing the memory. And what EMDR does is that it goes back to the memories and you get a chance to learn from that trauma not high.
Mm.
Not high. So you're going back to these sensory things that happened and you get a chance to learn, but you're not high and dissociating. That's why some of you who may research about EMDR are us as clinicians, we do our best to not have our clients and patients dissociate during EMDR because then guess what? Basically, then they're getting high and you don't want that because the point is you want to reverse that, right? You don't want them, like staying in that dissociation. You try to treat that.
Wow.
So that's why we do what we do because we were dissociated because the injury, the perpetration, the enmeshment, it causes us to dissociate. We get high. We learn distorted things, which justifies why we keep doing it. And literally, we're addicted to that feeling. We're addicted to that to activating it through enmeshment because we learned how to socially bond in an enmeshed way. So we don't know any other way to be. And that's also why it's very, because we normalize it in society. We normalize it and it's like, oh, this is social bonding, this is cool, to the point where
It's so normalized.
it's so absolutely normalized. And that doesn't help either.
No.
The fact that it's so normalized. And that's also another reason why our narcissism, that we couldn't see it for what it is, because so much of our narcissism is so normalized. So to be clear, everyone, I'm not saying that the traditional narcissist doesn't exist, because they do. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but that but there's a way for said people to get better, and there's a different way of looking at the darkness within yourself too. So if we omit the darkness within ourselves, because you see, when we've had a perpetrator attack us, we unfortunately learn to be perpetrators against ourselves. That's got to stop. And that's what fawning is. It's about perpetrating against yourself. And you will also end up perpetrating others. There's no way that you won't also transgress and be passive aggressive. There's no way. Like, I have never had anybody that I've worked with, if I sit down with them, we start looking at stuff, we're going to find out how you've actually been manipulative to other people and been immoral. No one's perfect. Again, that's back to perfectionism. So it's more like saying the narcissist is the epitome of imperfection, and I'm perfect, and I'm not the narcissist. That's what it's about: reputation, perfection, avoiding feelings of shame. So in other words, when you talk about narcissism and
Mm.
people calling people narcissists, they're shaming them. I'm going
Oh
to
yeah.
shame that person and call them a narcissist and shame them. And it's like, no, you don't want to sit with your shame. So you're not going to project that onto somebody else. That way you don't have to deal with it, which in and of itself is narcissistic.
Mm.
That's narcissistic. That's manipulative. That in and of itself is manipulative, because it's demonizing one group of people, that basically saying they have less value and worth as a human being compared to me. So that's actually that could actually even be seen in the traditionally narcissistic way, right? So I know there's a lot to talk about, but that it's complex. It's complex. There's a lot.
I know. It's like we're getting to the end. We have 4 minutes left, and I'm just like, you keep saying things that I could go so deep on.
What do you have any? What about some of the questions that your followers had? I was curious.
They, you
Did
answered
I
all
already
of them.
answer?
I
Did
was,
I answer all of them? Good.
you
Okay.
answered all of them. A lot of them were just like, how do you know if you are one, which you answered. Um, yeah, how do you break the cycle? That was pretty much the gist of it. Um,
There's
yeah.
a huge there's a huge reward in this for those of you all, like if you reframe it in this way, there's actually a huge reward in this. Um, you know, the kind of the kind of you are it's a lot of personality development. So another question I guess I could answer, but maybe wasn't asked of me, was again the personality disorder or the addiction, right? And here's the thing. Um, it's not that one does not have an issue with one's personality, because there are problems, but it has to do with what causes the personality problem. And what causes the personality problem is the addiction. Why? Because then you create your whole personality around getting hits. Then it's all about like, how can I get hits? How can I, that's the motivation. Like, how can I get the next hit? How can I, and hits, I call hits in my work, like basically enmeshment. Like, you're getting hits. You're basically getting an attachment need for acting in an enmeshed way. It's a little negotiation. It's like, you do this, I'll do that. Gets the covert contracts. See, that's why I teach.
I'm
That's why
just speechless.
that gets into love bombing, which is very fawning, right? Love bombing is fawning, right?
Oh no, don't say that though. It is, it is.
It can be,
Yeah,
can be.
totally. I mean, yeah, I mean, totally. I know with I I teach in some of my programs, like how to feel somatically, how fawning feels in your body. And for myself, it feels like wanting to giggle, and it feels like me wanting to just compliment you. Compliment, I can come up with anything. I've been practicing it for years. I could literally look at someone I don't like anything on them and create a compliment because I'm practiced in it. And I feel like that is similar to love bombing.
Because
And
you
I
crit
feel,
this is so raw what I'm getting ready to tell you. This is gonna be nasty. Because y'all look, I'm raw, right? I'm like
tell me,
fawning is like when an animal poops on the floor
oh
to
God,
dis to distract the perpetrator and then takes off. That's what that is. It means I'm gonna put something that smells interesting. I'm gonna put that there so that I can run and be safe.
say
That's
more.
what that basically means. It means I'm gonna put something that you smell that you totally fixate on. It's so that I can run and be safe.
Hmm. So while you're
Okay.
busy thinking about
How
how
wonderful you are.
nice I said your outfit looks, you're not
Yes,
going to be attacking me.
right. You're not gonna attack me. I'm gonna be safe because I'm gonna say all these nice things. You're gonna focus on that. That way you don't hurt me.
Well, I could go on with this conversation for hours. We're at the end. Thank you so much for your time. Like literally this, I wish we had more of this in this space because the traditional the narcissist is a terrible person and I'm the martyr. Although it's validating, like you said, in some spaces where narcissistic abuse is very real, it's it's validating and helpful. And also, I think ultimately, in the big picture, it's harmful because we're just creating more division. So I very much appreciate your nuance. And I think we need more of it. And hopefully, we're moving that direction.
I
Uh,
hope so too. I certainly hope so because for those that are, concerned with narcissistic abuse, if you look at your own narcissism, you also actually end up protecting yourself better.
this is what I said to someone the other day. They said, this will be the last thing and then we'll wrap up. But they said, why do I keep attracting narcissists? And
Mm.
I said, well, you're a fawner. I work with people that are recovering people pleasers. I'm one myself. And when you are fawning, someone who's really healthy and has great boundaries, they're not going to want to engage with someone who's like just giving themselves to you. It's not attractive. Like the more that you, like you said, find yourself, find your personality, the less attractive that is. And so who finds that attractive? The other side of that, which is, someone else who also doesn't have great boundaries.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So thank you so much for your time. Is there any last thoughts or any, I'd love you to say just like where people can find you on social media, the test that you mentioned before, and then anything else you'd like to promote.
Sure. I think that if if you're interested in, and you're hearing what I'm saying, you're like, oh man, like what kind of like with my narcissism, what is that like? And I have it labeled as mild, moderate, or severe. So I don't call it narcissistic personality disorder. I very much renamed it just narcissistic disorder, because it's an addiction. So you just go to my website at narcissismrehabilitation.com, right? And then the assessment is on the front page, and it's only like 10 questions or 11 questions. And you'll get a sense of whether you're mild, moderate, or severe narcissist. And that'll also, even if you don't want to use the term because you're still like, oh, I don't want to use it, that's all right. Because you know what? You can look at it and go, you can actually look at it and go, how bad is my enmeshment? Because it's either mild enmeshment, moderate enmeshment, or severe enmeshment. And then you really get a sense of where you're at with that.
Awesome. And do you have any resources for people who would like to commence a detox?
Hmm. Um, I don't. And that's because all of the stuff that I'm actually quite critical of all the information that's online and books. Unfortunately, I haven't really found anything that really helps people to do that in a way that doesn't enable more narcissistic behavior. Unfortunately, I wish, and I mean that, I really wish that I did, but I'm being honest, I haven't really seen that. There's too much enabling of narcissistic behavior within our culture. So the best thing I can recommend is to just listen to my podcast. That's going to be the best resource because the podcast is very much structured just like I would teach my courses online through audio. So it's the same kind of structure. So it's a way to have, the audio, little mini audio courses for free, like through the podcast. And it's just me, it's just me talking about stuff, teaching you concepts that are complicated. And then you can listen to as much as you need to, take notes, whatever. Um, but no, I haven't, I don't have any resource that for that because there's nobody teaching it like me. And then so it's kind of, I'm kind of the only resource in that regard. Um, but they're like, you mentioned that you're detoxing and going through your way. Um, the only other thing I can think of is again, like concept of shadow work, ego death. That's about as close, I guess, in resources you can kind of get. But even within that, unfortunately, there's a lot of narcissism, which we talked about within those
Mhm.
spaces. So it's complicated.
Okay, perfect. Just sounds like it's time to write a book. That's what I'm
Yes, I have
thinking.
been asked many times to write a book, but not yet. I almost did a year ago, and it's like, nope, I got to create the center. My vision is to have multiple narcissism, rehabilitation centers throughout the United States and hopefully outside the United States too. That would be great.
Yeah. Oh, we need it. Bad.
It's
Thank you so much for your time.
welcome.